definite descriptions. And I mentioned this without labeling it that way when we were talking about Russell. I used his example, the present King of France is bald. Or, I think I used this one as well, the author of Waverley is Scott, Sir Walter Scott. Here I notice Ayer does not say the author of Waverley was Scott, but was Scotch. Scottish. Well, Sir Walter Scott was Scottish. But his point is that the sentence, a sentence like that, the author of Waverley was Scotch, is equivalent to the following. And here's Russell's the theory of definite descriptions. That is to say, just how do you analyze a statement like the author of Waverley was Scotch? You want to analyze it into its logical constituents. One person and one person only wrote Waverley, and that person was Scotch. Now, you see, by opening up the logical meaning of the sentence, you now have statements that are more readily accessible to empirical verification or falsification. That's Ayer's point. By this exercise of logical analysis, what you are doing is asking yourself, is this statement a factually meaningful statement, or is it not? You see. And if it is, then you can refer it to whoever's appropriate business it is to determine its factuality, presumably to the literary critic. You see. It's not the business of the philosopher to ascertain truth, but only by careful logical analysis to determine who can ascertain truth. To ask, is it meaningful, empirically meaningful? Well, look again on page 64, and a further example that he gives at the bottom of that page, the new paragraph, he talks of the problem of giving an actual rule for translating sentences. Here's this business of logical analysis by finding a logically equivalent sentence, which is more amenable to empirical verification. The problem of translating sentences about a material body into sentences about sense data. Sense contents. Which may be called the problem of the reduction of material things to sense contents. Now, this is the main philosophical part of the traditional problem of perception. Now, think about that for a moment. The problem of perception, which is raised by Plato in the Republic and the Theaetetus, about the reliability of sense perception in telling us about the real nature of physical things. The problem of perception as posed by Locke's representational theory, and the correspondence between primary and secondary quality sensations on the one hand, material object on the other. Are primary qualities qualities of an object, as Locke thought, or are they purely subjective, as Berkeley thought? Okay? Now that's the kind of thing. And in the realist-idealist debate of the 1910s and the 1920s, remember when we were talking about G.E. Moore? G.E. Moore was unclear about the relationship between sense data that we're directly aware of and the material object. Are the sense data the qualities of surface patches on a material object? Or are the sense qualities rather simply subjective ideas which we ascribe to a material object? And it seems that the whole realist-idealist debate, the realist-phenomenalist debate of those days, hinged on the theory of sense data. And we'll be coming back to that later on. But he is saying that really the only philosophical significance to the thing is the question of whether whether sense-datum statements are the logical equivalent of material object statements. Or is there some left over in a material object statement that is not reducible to sense-datum statements? You see? Well, there's one notion involved in a material object statement of what you can call spatial occupancy. This space is taken. You see, spatial occupancy. Well, is that contained within sense-datum statements about color, size, shape, or not? And so you find that one of the debates which grows out of the positivist approach is whether the reduction of material objects, physical objects, to sense-datum statements can ever be complete. Okay. Now, there are some of the early positivists, like Moritz Schlick, who said, yes, it can be. And so he's inclined to be a physicalist, in the sense that our knowledge of sense data is a knowledge of physical objects. But on the other hand, Ayer is not so sure. He's not so sure. There seems to be some untranslatable ingredient in the language about material objects. So he comes out more as a phenomenalist, you see. He does make reference at one point to the need to have ostensive statements. Ostensive statements are ones, empirical sense-datum statements, they are ones which are so self-evident as to be absolutely certain. And he denies that there can be any such. Whereas some of the other logical positivists believe that there were ostensive statements, sense-datum statements that are absolutely certain. After all, you might suppose that a sense-datum statement about a color you observe is absolutely certain. But is it? Once you consider all the observation conditions that go into observing a color. Observation conditions about the light in which you're seeing things and so on and so forth. He does, later on, come down to the view, and he mentions this in that long introduction, that there are certain basic statements that we can appeal to that are much more sure than many others. Basic statements, but still not the absolute certainty of the ostensive statements. Now, this business of analyzing material object statements into sense-datum statements illustrates what becomes, for many philosophical concerns, a much larger issue. Because as the mind-body question came under discussion, using these tools, the question was whether mental state statements are translatable without remainder into brain state statements. That is to say, whether you can adopt a physicalist interpretation of mind. Now, this, after the taboo about metaphysics is lifted, becomes very significant. Because the attempt of the eliminative materialist, the materialist who wants to eliminate mind, is not only to eliminate a metaphysical entity called mind, but also to eliminate any language about mind. Because mental state language, he thinks, can be translatable without remainder into physical state language, including brain states. You see? Whereas others will say there's one dimension that is lost in that. Mental state language is an I language rather than an it language. And the self-referentiality of the I language of mental states is what is lost. Incidentally, if you've read any of the writings of Donald Mackay, M-C-K-A-Y, the English brain scientist and philosopher, also an evangelical, his books have been published by InterVarsity Press and circulated quite widely. Donald Mackay, as a brain scientist, used this technique in criticizing purely materialistic interpretations of human nature, maintaining that physical state language omits the I language, the I states of mental state language. I remember talking with him one time. We were both of us speaking at conferences, two different conferences which happened to meet in the same facility. And so we gravitated to each other at dinner time for 3 nights running and had a 3 stages philosophical dialogue accordingly, largely about this issue. And I'd sat in on one of his presentations and was trying to suggest to him that all he was doing was saying that we can understand human nature if we use physical state, brain state language, and mental state language, but that's not saying anything about the nature of mind. That's just using empirical language, empirical data language. You're not doing anything to the mind-body problem. You're not saying anything about the existence of mind. To which he responded, eventually after we'd worked through this, that, and the other, well, how would I say it? What would I have to go on? All I've got is what the Bible says and empirical data. And the Bible doesn't say anything explicitly about the existence of a metaphysical entity called mind or soul. I said, well, what about a metaphysical assertion? Some metaphysical conceptualization? And he leaned back and said, metaphysical? And then the penny dropped. You mean you're operating with the empirical verifiability criteria? Yeah. He was a positivist. You see? He wanted, as an empirical scientist, to stick with either empirical data or biblical data. Get it? And he was therefore stuck about handling metaphysical questions that are involved in certain Christian beliefs. Okay. He was a remarkable individual, and I think one of the real losses was that he died of cancer just a couple of years ago. A man who was still publishing and doing some first-rate work.